Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
The last words my mother said before I packed my bags for college were not the kind that most parents would choose when their child stood on the edge of such a life-changing step. There was no, "we're proud of you," no, "we'll help if we can," not even a simple, "good luck." Instead, she looked me in the eyes, lips pressed thin, and said, "Figure it out." That was it, three cold, dismissive words that felt like a door slamming in my face. At that moment, I understood my place in this family wasn't as a daughter being cheered on, but as someone expected to carry a load that no one else cared to help with, and the sound of those words stuck in my chest like a shard of glass. I had already worked myself ragged through high school, taking shifts at the diner after classes, tucking away tips in a jar that always seemed to get emptied by new car repairs or the rising cost of groceries. I wasn't asking them to pay for 4 years of private education or to set me up with a car and a dorm room makeover like I had seen on television. All I asked was for some help, anything to ease the mountain of loans I knew I was about to take on. My father barely looked up from his phone when I asked, just muttered something about toughening up and how debt builds character. Then my stepmother, Karen, chimed in with her sharp laugh and said, "If she can't make it on her own, how will she ever survive out there?" As if the world was some battlefield she already knew I'd be crushed by. And there I was, standing in the kitchen, realizing that the only family I had was rooting for me to fail because it made their own choices look better. Then there was Alyssa, Karen's daughter. My so-called stepsister, though she had never once acted like a sister to me. If I was the invisible one in the house, she was the shining star, bathed in a light that no one else could dim. She breezed through life without a job, without stress, and without even a hint of gratitude. She always had her nails done, new shoes showing up in boxes on the porch, her gas tank miraculously never running empty. Meanwhile, I was piecing together secondhand textbooks, skipping dinners to save cash, and mentally calculating every penny I owed. Alyssa would walk past me with a smirk, toss her hair, and make a comment about how tired I looked, as if exhaustion was some kind of fashion flaw. That summer, as I packed for college, I swallowed my pride and asked one last time. We were sitting at dinner, the smell of roast chicken filling the room, my father in a good mood for once after some small win at work. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I timed it right, I could appeal to some forgotten sense of fairness. I explained that tuition was due, that I had covered as much as I could with scholarships and loans, but the gap was still bigger than I could fill. I watched his face change from amusement to irritation, as though my request had ruined his evening. My mother's silence was heavier than words. Karen set down her fork with deliberate slowness and said, "You'll figure it out. Everyone does." And then the subject was closed, as final as a judge's gavel. So I did what I had to do. I figured it out. I filed more loan paperwork than I knew existed, signed my name on forms that would shackle me to debt for decades, and picked up a job at the campus coffee shop before I even unpacked my bags. I worked weekends at a grocery store near the dorms, telling myself it was temporary, that one day I would look back and be proud I survived without anyone's help. But pride was hard to feel when I saw my parents posting vacation photos online, smiling on a beach in Florida while I ate microwaved noodles in a room barely big enough for a bed and a desk. Every picture of them happy looked like proof that I was the only one outside the circle, hustling while they lived comfortably. The resentment grew quietly, like mold in a corner no one notices at first. I tried to tell myself that I was stronger for it, that I didn't need them. Yet the bitterness leaked through every time Alyssa called me to brag about some new outfit or how she had spent the day relaxing while I was mopping floors. Her words felt like deliberate salt in wounds she didn't even acknowledge. I wondered if she ever realized how much our situations contrasted, or if she just enjoyed having me as the silent comparison that made her shine brighter. But nothing prepared me for what happened when I came home a few weeks later, hoping to grab some winter clothes I couldn't afford to replace. I walked in without warning, dropped my bag by the door, and froze at the sight in front of me. My father was smiling, my mother was nodding warmly, and Karen was holding a small gift box with exaggerated ceremony. And there was Alyssa, her face glowing as if she had just won a prize. From the box, Karen pulled out a brand new house key, shining under the light, and pressed it into Alyssa's manicured hand. My parents clapped like it was some graduation ceremony, like Alyssa had earned the right to claim this house as her own. I stood there unnoticed for a few seconds, the chill from outside still clinging to my coat, my heart pounding with something between disbelief and fury. All I could think was, when I begged for help with something that could change my future, they told me to figure it out. Yet when Alyssa wanted comfort, when she wanted a safety net she didn't even need, they handed her the front door to the only home I had ever known. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just unfair. It was war. And they had no idea that I was about to fight back. I would love to tell you I let the key ceremony slide off me like rain on a windshield, that I pretended it meant nothing and went upstairs to pack my sweaters and get back to campus. But the truth is that I felt something slow and dangerous click into place. A patient kind of anger that doesn't blow the roof off in a minute, that instead takes inventory, reads the room, and keeps walking. So I hung up my coat, congratulated Alyssa with a smile that probably looked real enough for a photograph, and headed down the hallway where the carpets still held the faint detergent smell I'd always associated with home, if home can be described as the place where you learn who you are by exactly how people refuse to help you. In Alyssa's room, which always felt like a boutique pretending to be a bedroom, there were shopping bags lined up like obedient dogs, lip gloss, salon gift cards, a sweater with a designer's name screaming across the chest. And there on the desk under a pink lamp I found the kind of proof that doesn't shout, it just stares, a cluster of envelopes with my father's handwriting and an email printout with the subject line, automatic transfer confirmation. And I wish I could say I didn't open them. But those papers had my family's answers and I was owed answers, so I looked and saw car insurance paid ahead for 6 months, a credit card balance cleared just in time for a weekend trip to the coast with her boyfriend, and a neat spreadsheet listing. Household support amounts for Alyssa that outstripped the gap in my tuition by more than a little, and I understood that when they told me to figure it out, what they really meant was that they had already decided who counted and it wasn't me. I stood there a bit too long, hands shaking in a way I hoped the lamplight wouldn't magnify, and thought about every night I'd closed the coffee shop with my fingers raw from scrubbing the drains, about every morning shift I'd stacked on top of it just to pay for cafeteria meal swipes that ran out by mid-semester, about the day financial aid warned me I was at the ceiling for subsidized loans, and anything else would balloon like a bad joke. And I felt this bitter, almost funny clarity that if the family was a corporation, then I had never been a stakeholder. I had been the unpaid intern they kept around for the optics. Karen's voice floated down the hall, exaggerated and sweet. She was explaining to my mother that responsibility builds character, which, coming from someone who believed expiration dates were a personal attack, nearly made me laugh. And I decided in that moment that my revenge would not be a tantrum, not a confrontation that gave them a messy scene to point at later and say I was the problem, but rather the kind of quiet misalignment that forces people to look at the mess they made without me as their scapegoat. So I walked back to the kitchen, printed my tuition statement from my email on their shiny new printer, slid the single page into the big farmhouse frame where the family rules sign used to sit, no yelling, love each other, be kind, the usual Hobby Lobby gospel, and set the frame back on the wall at perfect eye level so no one could miss the bold total with its cheerful minus sign. Then I reset the router, changed the network name to Figure It Out, and the password to a long, smug sentence that referenced scholarships and part-time jobs, and left a sticky note on the modem that said, "Call your unpaid IT department," which, yes, was petty, but also tasted like justice. I knew that was only the warm-up, the small plate before the entree, because the papers in Alyssa's room had opened a door in my head I couldn't close, so I kept moving, not reckless, not loud, just attentive, and in the old roll-top desk in the guest room, the one that held passports, warranties, and tax folders stacked by year, I found the file that made my knees go soft, a narrow manila envelope labeled Education Fund, which sounded like a joke until I saw the form with my name typed neatly across the top as original beneficiary, a college savings account established when I was still losing baby teeth, and then a later page with a date right after my high school graduation, where the beneficiary was changed to Alyssa, followed by a withdrawal record that could have covered my freshman year with room to breathe, and I had to sit down because the room tilted like a boat in a wake. I photographed everything with steady, careful hands, not because I planned to wave it under anyone's nose at dinner, but because institutions speak in documents and I had decided I would start speaking their language. Which meant I drafted an email to financial aid asking about a dependency override for students whose family support claims did not match reality, and I composed it without heat, full of dates and amounts and official words, the kind that cannot be dismissed as jealousy, while another part of my brain, the part that still wanted someone to say they were sorry, kept whispering that if they had just said we made mistakes, we didn't know, we were wrong, I might have backspaced the whole thing and walked away. Only they didn't say anything. And the house hummed along like always, because people who are comfortable rarely pause to test the temperature of the water they're soaking in. When Karen finally discovered the framed tuition bill and the Wi-Fi rename, she stormed into the hallway with that practice smile stretched tight and breath that smelled like cinnamon gum, demanding to know what kind of stunt I thought I was pulling in her home. Which was useful because there it was, said aloud, a declaration of ownership that didn't include me, and I very calmly told her I was simply labeling things according to reality, that labels help with organization, and that if anyone needed the old network name she could try family support, though I suspected the signal had always been weak. Then I walked past her into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and set down a neat stack of labeled leftovers I had purchased with my own money for the week I was visiting, because even my pettiness prefers a paper trail. My small revenge for that day, measured, polite, entirely satisfying, was complete when my father, who hates being inconvenienced more than he hates being wrong, spent a long, fuming hour on the phone with the internet provider while the television buffered and Alyssa whined about missing her show, and I pretended to read at the table while actually watching the manila envelope slide deeper into my tote bag. A quiet exit for a loud truth, and by the time I stood to go upstairs, the front door rattled with the cheerful sound of a key sliding into a lock, Alyssa chirping something about how great it felt to belong, while my phone buzzed with a reply from financial aid asking for a brief meeting and any supporting documentation. And that was when I realized the next move wouldn't be played in this kitchen at all, but in an office with fluorescent lights and forms, where figure it out was about to cost somebody more than a password change. The financial aid office lived in that part of campus where the walls were painted a color that wanted to be cheerful, but had clearly been chosen by a committee with coupons. And the fluorescent lights hummed the way old refrigerators hum when they think no one is listening. Yet the woman who called my name spoke with the kind of careful kindness that doesn't try to fix you. It just gives you a chair, a glass of water, and a pile of forms with enough blank lines to hold the story people at home refused to hear. So I sat down, laid out my documents like cards in a game I had finally learned the rules to, and watched her face as she read the printout with the words, Education Fund, Beneficiary Change, the auto-transfer confirmations for Alyssa's bills, and the neat little ledger of household support that had my name filed under 0, which, as it turns out, is a number that tells a whole truth without raising its voice. She asked questions the way a good nurse touches a bruise, not to make it hurt again, but to see what the injury means, and I answered with dates and specifics and the kind of humor that keeps you from crying in public, explaining that when I was told to figure it out, I did, by stacking shifts, living on noodles, and learning to smile at customers who wanted me to be grateful for their spare change. And when she nodded, I felt something small unclench, because belief is a medicine you don't realize you need it until your shoulders drop and the rest of you follows. And when she explained professional judgment and dependency override in plain English, when she said the institution could, after review, recognize my reality instead of the family myth written on tax forms, I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from floating right out of it. We built a file together, the way people build scaffolding when the house itself refuses to hold weight, and she told me what letters help and what letters merely add noise, so I sent careful emails to 2 supervisors from my jobs, to a high school counselor who remembered too many lunch periods spent in the library, and to a friend's mother who picked me up twice when my car died and my parents sent a thumbs-up emoji rather than a ride, and by the time the sun moved past the window and slapped the carpet into another shade of beige, The packet was thick enough to matter, which is not the same as thick enough to fix everything, but it was a start, and then she asked me one last question that felt like a hand extended on a narrow bridge. Whether I wanted to remove parental access to my academic and billing information, because families who do not fund your future sometimes still want to audit it, and I said yes, please, all of it, and signed the FERPA release with a little tremor that felt suspiciously like relief. I walked out of that building with a copy of the appeal and a timeline that would not, for once, bend to my mother's calendar or my father's temper, and I headed straight to work with the sense that I had shifted a gear inside myself. That instead of begging at a door that kept closing, I had found a different entrance with a clerk who recognized my name, and yet the day still had hours left, and the next scene in this charming family play was the weekly dinner where everyone pretends the food is love, so I drove over with a tote full of laundry and a spine stiff enough to balance a tray. Dinner was a parade of small performances that have been rehearsed for years, Karen complimenting herself for cooking while holding a store receipt, my father reciting headlines like he wrote them, my mother moving from chair to chair smoothing invisible wrinkles, and Alyssa drifting in late with a squeal of hinges from her new key and a story about a shopping trip that must have been emotionally exhausting given the number of bags she had to carry, and somewhere between the salad no one eats and the roast everyone pretends to like, she announced that her boyfriend's landlord had offered them a sweet deal if she became the named tenant because parents who take care of their kids look great on applications. After which she turned to me with a pitying smile that could have rotted teeth and asked whether my little campus job covered more than coffee. It would have been easy to rage, to make a scene that could be edited later into a cautionary tale about ungrateful daughters, but I had learned to measure my oxygen, so I reached into my tote, slid 3 cleanly printed forms across the table like coasters, and explained, cheerfully and with perfect diction, that I needed brief signatures to certify, for the record, that I received no ongoing support, that the household did not fund my tuition or living expenses, and that any funds previously earmarked for my education had been reallocated to a different beneficiary. The room did that thing where air gets thick and faces learn to pretend. My father bristled about documentation. Karen reached for a lawyerly tone that never survives contact with facts, and my mother whispered my name like I had thrown a glass, but Alyssa, God bless a personality that confuses attention with oxygen, laughed and said, "That's fine. We don't pay for anything of hers anyway," which, as I explained politely, would be very helpful language on a notarized statement. My revenge for the night was not fireworks, but paperwork, a quiet inversion of power where the only raised voice belonged to the printer that would later spit their signatures into a system that respects ink far more than memory. And after dessert, I emailed the financial aid officer with scanned copies, added a summary of the dinner quote, and encoded every sentence with dates and amounts that would survive scrutiny. Then I changed my emergency contact from home to my friend Mia, who once drove me to urgent care at midnight without asking for gas money, and I ported my phone line off the family plan with the help of a clerk who wore empathy like a badge, so by the time I lay down on the childhood bed that had become a guest cot, the house felt less like a fortress I had to breach and more like a museum where everything still works, but nothing matters to me anymore. Just before sleep, my phone buzzed with an email whose subject line was as polite as a tap on the shoulder, preliminary determination, and when I opened it I saw the kind of sentence that changes the angle of your future. A note that my override looked strong pending one more verification and that, if approved, an institutional grant could replace a chunk of the loans I had taken on in despair, along with a procedural note that the office would send a verification letter to the addresses on file asking whether any support had been provided contrary to the declarations signed at dinner, and I stared at the screen long enough to memorize the words, then turned it face down on the pillow. Because in the quiet hallway beyond my door I could hear Alyssa telling Karen how great it would be to throw a few small get-togethers now that she had her own key, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that rides shotgun with patience, that the next door to open in this house would not be the one she expected. The week after the dinner confrontation, The house felt like a stage set for a play I had learned to direct without anyone's permission, where each actor moved in a script written long before I understood the lines, and I, the quiet understudy, had finally been handed a cue that could change the outcome without ever raising my voice. The days were long with tension and polite smiles, and I moved through the rooms like a shadow in plain sight, watching Karen fuss over dishes she would later criticize, seeing my mother drift from phone call to phone call with that practiced calm that barely concealed annoyance, and noticing my father's eyes flick toward Alyssa whenever she laughed. The way a man notices a painting he never painted but still wants everyone to admire. Alyssa herself carried the new key like a talisman, swinging it lightly on her finger as she walked through hallways that I had walked countless times, each step echoing the difference in how we were treated, and I took careful notes of her movements. The way she left shoes scattered with imperceptible calculation, the way she flaunted tiny privileges, an extra scoop of ice cream, a borrowed dress, a request fulfilled instantly by my parents' anxious compliance, that I catalogued not with anger, but with clarity, because I understood finally that knowledge is the beginning of strategy, and I was about to plan a course of action that would cost them nothing but attention and make me the architect of consequences they refused to see coming. I started small, quietly accumulating evidence and aligning allies, not because I needed validation, but because I had learned the painful truth that families who choose favorites often leave traces that bureaucracy respects more than feelings. So I gathered receipts, statements, and digital footprints, and over evenings filled with college assignments and coffee-stained notebooks, I cross-referenced dates, transfers, and purchases until the story of financial favoritism unfolded in a pattern too clear to ignore, and I printed a copy for my own reference, a silent blueprint for what would become the careful unfolding of justice without dramatics. The kind that leaves no one to complain about theatrics, because the performance is invisible until the results are undeniable. One Thursday, the perfect opportunity arose at the weekly family dinner, an event that usually served as a showcase for Alyssa's privileges, where Karen would announce a new indulgence and my parents would beam as if she were the sun and the rest of us merely orbiting in minor, less noticed paths. Alyssa arrived later than usual, fluttering through the door with a story about a shopping trip that required at least 4 credit cards and 3 bags, and my mother smiled so broadly it hurt my ribs to see, the kind of smile that masks awareness of injustice with pride in someone else's fortune, and I, armed with the quiet knowledge that the system, when fed truth, bends in favor of the prepared, set my own plan into motion, not out of vengeance, but out of a deliberate choice to claim my independence and make a statement that I had been underestimated for too long. I brought with me a carefully organized portfolio containing every proof of inequity, every documented instance of funds redirected from me to Alyssa, and every email confirming that I had no support from the household. Placing it on the dining table as casually as setting a napkin, then asking in my calmest tone for signatures acknowledging the facts, emphasizing accuracy for compliance, and allowing my parents to realize only in that moment that the polite meal had transformed into a formal verification that would be reviewed by an external office, which meant that their favorite child's privileges were now subject to scrutiny and that every casual comment, every shrug of neglect, had consequences that were not immediate but inevitable. And the shift in atmosphere was palpable, though they did not voice it. Alyssa, ever oblivious to nuance unless it was announced with confetti, laughed and said something about how dramatic I was being, which allowed me to smile politely and explain, again with perfect calm, that documenting reality is not dramatic when reality has consequences, and as she waved the key in the air with delight, I noted mentally the way my father's hand twitched toward the wine glass, as if the weight of bureaucracy had landed in his chest, and I could almost hear the internal calculations spinning behind their polite faces, realizing, finally, that control is an illusion when the rules you have ignored are enforced by someone who understands them. By the end of dinner, I had secured signatures, verified dates, and ensured that financial aid would have a clear, unassailable record, all while Alyssa continued to chatter about weekend plans that involved her boyfriend, spa appointments, and minor luxuries I could not afford, Yet she was unaware that the foundation she relied upon was quietly being examined and documented, and when I left the table, carrying my tote of work clothes and my folder of evidence, I felt a weight shift in the air. A subtle realignment that no one could name, but that would, in the coming weeks, change how decisions were made in that household and demonstrate that patience, knowledge, and careful planning can become tools sharper than anger or confrontation. Later that night, I sat in the quiet of my old bedroom, now mine only in memory, reviewing each document again, marking notes in precise order, and imagining the unfolding of consequences that would arrive without fanfare. Leaving my parents to discover, in slow increments, that the world does not bend to favoritism when someone else has learned the rules, and that independence, once claimed, can become its own form of satisfaction, so complete and measured that it outlasts resentment and transforms it into quiet, enduring power, and I understood finally that the best revenge is often the one that arrives without warning, silently rearranging lives while maintaining the appearance of ordinary days. The morning of my graduation arrived like a slow sunrise over a city that had learned to ignore shadows, the sky pale and the air crisp, carrying with it a sense of culmination that no applause could quite capture. And as I dressed in the cap and gown I had earned through years of relentless work, balancing double shifts, loans, and the kind of self-discipline that leaves a quiet ache in your muscles and a sharper one in your chest, I realized that the years of being told to figure it out had prepared me not only for the ceremony ahead but for a moment of triumph that did not require anyone's approval, and the satisfaction of it rested in the knowledge that I had done more than survive. I had created an outcome that could not be claimed, diminished, or taken away by those who had once dismissed me. The ceremony itself unfolded with the measured pace of tradition, speeches that straddled the line between inspiration and obligation, and the slow procession of students onto the stage. But I moved through it like someone who had learned to inhabit each moment with the gravity of achievement and the lightness of detachment, shaking hands with professors who remembered my persistence, letting the applause wash over me without need for validation from a family that had long ago shown where their priorities lay, and as my name was called, I felt the thrill of recognition, the kind that does not need embellishment because it carries the weight of years of effort, struggle, and self-sufficiency in every syllable, and when I accepted my diploma, the handshake, the photograph, and the small, inevitable smiles of peers who had been companions in this journey, I knew that the scene I had been denied at home would unfold in its own quiet, invisible way. While my parents sat at home, expecting perhaps a phone call, a photograph, a moment of inclusion in a ritual that had always centered around their version of family achievement, they would soon discover that absence can carry a message more potent than presence, and that by choosing to disengage from a system that had failed me, I had claimed authority over my own narrative, leaving them to contemplate the consequences of favoritism, the allocation of resources, and the cumulative effect of dismissing a child who demanded nothing but fairness. Alyssa, who had so carelessly flaunted her key and privileges, would find, when she finally attempted to use her access, that locks had been changed, schedules rearranged, and routines established in a way that reminded her, quietly but unmistakably, that access without effort carries little weight when independence has been claimed elsewhere. In the days following the graduation, the messages began to arrive: calls from my mother, inquiries from my father, and the occasional text from Alyssa that carried a veneer of casualness, but betrayed the underlying realization that the ground had shifted beneath their assumptions, and as I responded calmly, with a measured politeness that masks both amusement and finality, I understood that the narrative had been inverted in a manner both clever and entirely irreversible, because it relied not on shouting or confrontation, but on the quiet application of intelligence, patience, and strategic timing, all of which I had accumulated over years of navigating a family that refused to see me. The aftermath was not the melodrama of cinematic revenge, but the subtle, enduring satisfaction of having constructed outcomes that spoke louder than words, and as I settled into my first apartment, furnished entirely with my own earnings and carefully budgeted purchases, I reflected on the past, on the long evenings of labor, the nights of calculating every expense, the moments when I had wished for a hand to hold or a word of encouragement, and realized that the absence of support had taught me skills and resilience that could not be bought or gifted, leaving me not only independent but fortified in a way that my family could not diminish, and in the quiet of that new space, I allowed myself a rare smile, acknowledging both the injustice I had endured and the cleverness with which I had transformed it into opportunity. The ultimate satisfaction of my quiet revenge lay not in humiliation, but in the reestablishment of equilibrium, a redefinition of what it means to be valued, and a demonstration that merit and perseverance carry consequences that favoritism cannot negate. So when I received a brief, frustrated message from Alyssa asking why she could not enter the home she had long considered hers, I allowed the knowledge that she had finally encountered the limits of unearned advantage to sink in without comment, leaving her to discover that privilege, unbacked by diligence or foresight, is fragile, and that the doors one is handed in life mean little when the key to success has been claimed through effort, planning, and unwavering determination. The final moment of reflection came as I placed my diploma on the wall and looked around my apartment, the space I had earned through sweat, careful calculation, and relentless focus, and I understood that some doors, once closed by the choices of others, do not merely stay locked. They remind you that the most profound victories are often invisible to those who never anticipated them, and that independence, once claimed, carries a satisfaction and quiet power that no favoritism, no key, and no parental gesture can ever undermine, leaving me finally at peace with both the past and the future, and aware that the life I had built would endure beyond the pettiness and the inequity that had once seemed insurmountable.